Last topic for chapter 2, it's actually 2 topics, but these are both really short, so I grouped them together. They don't really have anything to do with each other, but they were both just short, so I figured it'd be easier to just put it in one video in PowerPoint for you. So we're going to talk about autophagy and pathologic calcification. So first, autophagy, what does that mean? That is literally, auto is self and phagy is eating, so this is literally eating self. So this is a process in which a cell eats its own content, so kind of like a cannibalistic mechanism. And so typically this is going to be a survival mechanism. So it's basically an adaptive response, typically during nutrient deprivation, which allows that cell to eat itself or cannibalize itself in order to survive. And so by trying to survive and eating itself, it actually kills itself. So how does this happen? Basically, you have a sequestration of cellular organelles into the cytoplasmic autophagic vacuole. So what does that mean? It's a lot of big words. But basically on here, you can see that you're creating this autophagosome, right? So this is about to eat itself. So this is a cell that is about to eat itself. So what happens is the lysosome is going to eat up part of its cell, and then that turns into an autolysosome. And so this, while inherently it's not a bad process, if it's dysregulated, that can play a role in various types of cancer and inflammatory bowel disease and also some neurodegenerative disorders. And it also may play a role in host defense against certain microbes. So if you have some sort of infection, your cells can go ahead and eat themselves as a defensive mechanism. So I don't really expect you to know the whole process of this in detail. This is a simplified version. Your book goes into more detail, but you don't need to know all the details. Just know that this is a way that the cell can eat itself in order to try to survive, and that it can be a protective mechanism, and that if it goes wrong or it's dysregulated, it can play a role in some pathologies that we'll learn later. And that's pretty much it. Now, moving on to the pathologic calcification. So this is when you have abnormal tissue deposition of calcium salts and other things such as iron, magnesium, and other mineral salts. So there's 2 forms of pathologic calcification. You have dystrophic and metastatic calcification. So dystrophic calcification is going to occur locally in dying tissues. And importantly, I would star this. This is when you have normal serum calcium levels. So this is going to happen despite normal serum levels of calcium, and so the patient typically doesn't have any calcium metabolism problems. So why is this happening? It's typically going to happen in areas of necrosis, so in multiple types of necrosis, so caseous, liquefactive, coagulative, etc., and also in fat necrosis. So this is going to be when tissue's dying and calcium levels are normal. That is the main takeaway you want to get from this. And there's a lot of different places that this tends to happen, but I have a couple like classic examples for you here. So this is pretty much always going to be present in atherosclerosis that is advanced. So when the atheromas or the atheromatous plaques become advanced, you'll have some calcification. It can also happen in heart valves. And so if you have a damaged heart valve, it can actually become calcified, which actually just progressively worsens the function of that valve. And so while this technically is just a sign of previous cell injury, this is like an adaptation, not an adaptation, but if the cells are dying, you can get this calcification. And so when you're seeing it, it's just telling you, oh, there was some sort of cell injury that caused necrosis. But so like it in and of itself, that's not that important, but it's often a cause of organ dysfunction. So in the example of the heart valve that I gave you, if you have a valve that is calcified, or you have a plaque that is calcified, that can cause organ dysfunction. So while the actual formation of this is not really that significant, it's just saying, oh, there was necrosis, it can lead to other pathologies. So grossly, what this is going to look like is your calcium salts are going to appear like fine white granules or sometimes clumps, and when you're feeling them, it feels kind of gritty. So it's just like a calcification. It can be like, it's usually whitish, sometimes it's yellowish depending on how much lipid. So in the example of plaques, it'll appear more yellow, but that's just because of the lipids. The actual calcification itself is white. So in types of breast cancer that have calcifications in them, those will appear more white. So that's a good example of that. So here's some pictures of them. So this is a heart valve that has become calcified. And so on here, you can see This would be just a normal valve, so this looks like an aortic valve probably, and so on the semilunar cusps here, you can see that this would be a calcification, that's calcification, all of this is calcification, all of this is calcification, so this is just a really ugly valve. This was probably not functioning very well at all. So now moving on to plaques, so atherosclerotic plaque. So on the left, this is a cross section of a vessel which has a plaque here. So this one, it's appearing more yellowish because again, you have a lot of the lipid in there, but that is a calcified plaque. You can see some more whitish calcified areas here. And then this is a full aorta, so this would be abdominal aorta down here, splitting into your common iliacs. Up here, this would be thoracic aorta, and it's attached to your heart. So this is clearly an autopsy specimen, but the aorta is opened up to see different patches of plaque. And so these down here, these are really good examples of if it's super calcified, how it's going to start to turn more white than it would be yellow. Now, histologically, what you're going to see with dystrophic or metastatic calcification, these are examples of dystrophic calcification. It's going to be very basophilic. So it's going to be this basophilic, amorphous, kind of granular, almost clumpy appearance. Sometimes it can be inside cells, sometimes it can be outside of cells, or sometimes you'll see it in and outside of cells. And interestingly, if this progresses, you can actually get some heterotopic bone formation at that focus of calcification. So this picture is showing you just one example of a little tiny calcified area, and so you can see it's just this amorphous clump of basophilic material. And it's not always going to look that nice. Oftentimes it will look like this, because when you're trying to cut these to make a slide, your blade is going to have a hard time cutting this area because it is calcified. And so oftentimes like this normally would be just full of purple calcification, right? This basophilic calcification, but it was difficult for them to cut. And so you kind of see it broken up here. So that's more often what it's going to look like, because sometimes you don't even realize that you have these calcifications, and so you don't decalcify the tissue. Now obviously if it was a huge calcification, you would feel that and you would decal it, but sometimes if you don't really know it's there, this is what it'll look like histologically. Now, over time, these can progress into things called psammoma bodies. And so psammoma bodies, it's basically like a lamellar organization of calcification. And so sometimes it won't be super basophilic like these guys over here, but typically, like this is the earlier formation of one. But a good, like classic psammoma body is this here. So it's dark, it's basophilic, and it's kind of like this lamellar appearance. So these are classically going to be found in some types of pathology. So I included one example for you here. This is papillary thyroid cancer, which we'll learn about when we get into thyroid, but this is a psammoma body. So psammoma bodies are one of the classic findings in papillary thyroid carcinoma. And moving on to metastatic calcification, this is going to be different because this happens in otherwise normal tissue. That is one of the main differences. And so it's not that you had these cells that died and underwent necrosis and then became calcified. The tissue itself is normal. So what could cause that? It's typically going to be some secondary cause of hypercalcemia. So there's tons of different things that can cause this, which we'll talk about throughout the rest of the year through this course. So for now, I just want you to understand the difference between dystrophic and metastatic calcification. So dystrophic is going to happen when cells have undergone necrosis and essentially the contents become calcified. So that's going to happen in specific areas, whereas metastatic calcification, this can be diffuse. It can happen throughout the body. Mainly it'll be in things like the gastric mucosa, lungs, pulmonary veins, systemic arteries, sometimes the kidneys, but it's going to be in otherwise normal tissue. That's the main takeaway. So if this is happening, it's going to be some diffuse hypercalcemia caused by some secondary to some other problem. So that's it. That is the last lecture for Chapter 2. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.